Thank you. The following is one of my voiceover demos. If you're a voiceover artist and you would like to advertise one of your demos on my podcast, please send an MP3 to thedrill12, all one word, at gmail.com. That's thedrill12 at gmail.com. Back in a minute.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Caesar's Palace for 12 rounds of boxing. In the red corner, from Los Angeles, California, wearing the red trunks with the gold trim, weighing in at 125 pounds, the lightweight champion of the world, Danny Little Red Lopez. Well, Bill, our winners get a home theater receiver. That's right. Experience the full potential of high-definition video with this 72-channel digital home theater receiver from Yamaha. But wait, that's not all. They also get a 5.1-channel surround sound system from Mirage. With 5 palm-sized speakers and a compact subwoofer cube, the MX 5.1 brings you huge immersive sound with Mirage's omnipolar technology. All from the Spiegel catalog, Chicago, Illinois, 60609. And they're taking closer order as down the stretch they come. Mr. Hot Stuff has 3 lengths to make up with chocolate candy last. On the rail, take the points behind that gallant son with chocolate candy gaining on the outside. In the lead is Pioneer of the Nile being tackled by chocolate candy. They're neck and neck as they come to the wire. And Pioneer of the Nile holds off chocolate candy and wins the Santa Anita Derby. And now, on your feet, time to greet holder of 14 NBA titles, your home team, your Los Angeles Lakers. Number 3 at 6'8", 5th year out of UCLA, playing forward, Trevor Ariza. Starting at center, number 17 at 7 feet, 4th year out of St. Andrews High School, Andrew Bynum. And at guard, number 24, 6'6", 13th season out of Royal Marion High School, Kobe Bryant.
Being a vegetarian, all joking aside, it is good for the environment. I think you should do things that are good for the environment. That's a value I have. It shouldn't be the only reason why you do something, though. Because there are some things that are good for the environment, bad for people. Like murder and cannibalism. Mathematically speaking, very good for the environment. What better way to lower your carbon footprint than to eat somebody else's? I'm not even saying that. That's a quote from Al Gore's book.
Good morning. It's Wednesday, Apollo Wednesday, September the 25th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have the patriotic shorts, motivation, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, the 33 strategies of war, and the Apollo program. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now, Barney and Company.
Thank you so much. That'll do it for us. We'll see you again tomorrow. Have a great day, everybody. Barney and Company picks it up. Stu, take it away.
Good morning, Maria, and good morning, everyone. The intelligence agencies have warned Donald Trump that the Iranians are trying to assassinate him. The campaign has been threatened, one plot already foiled. This is separate from the assassination attempts in Butler, Pennsylvania and Mar-a-Lago, Florida. It is direct interference by a foreign power in a U.S. election. No response yet from the Biden-Harris team. At the United Nations, Iran's president said he wants his country to play a constructive role in world affairs. He wants America to end sanctions. Later today, Kamala Harris outlines her economic policy. She says she's a capitalist and wants to work with the private sector. She wants to boost manufacturing. Donald Trump calls her the tax queen. He has his own plan for manufacturing. He says he's for low taxes and cheap energy. And if companies manufacture overseas, there will be stiff tariffs if they try to sell those products here. He would appoint a manufacturing ambassador whose job will be to bring manufacturing back to America. All right, let's go to the markets. Stock's pretty flat this morning after Tuesday's modest gains. The Dow, S&P, and the Nasdaq all down slightly. Bitcoin, we're looking at $63,000 a coin, not much change there. The 10-year Treasury yield right around 3.75%, 3.76. The 2-year just above 3.5%. Gold still around $2,600 an ounce. Actually, it's getting close to $2,700, $2,684. Oil, little change. Well, it's down $1 at 70. Gas, no change at $3.21. Diesel, unchanged, $3.58. More on politics. Harris would abandon the filibuster in order to pass a national abortion rights legislation. That would be a major change to the way the Senate works. Trump and Harris have agreed to dueling town halls hosted by a Spanish-language media company. They will be interviewed separately, 2 days apart. Not quite a debate. For the first time, Hezbollah fired a long-range missile at Tel Aviv. It was intercepted. Separately, Iran is trying to arrange for Russian advanced missiles for the Houthis in Yemen. And we will bring you a coffee shop owner whose store was shut down by college authorities because she was pro-police. She just won $4 million worth of damages. Wednesday, September 25th, 2024. Varney and Company is about to begin.
And that was Varney and Company. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Stuart Varney's editorial, such as it is.
Iran is directly interfering in the election. The mullahs are trying to assassinate Donald Trump. Imagine that. A foreign government plotting to kill a presidential candidate. Intelligence officials have briefed Trump on the threats. At least one plot has been foiled. At a safe house in Iran, a Pakistani man planned an assassination. He came to America with lots of cash, tried to hire a hitman. The FBI posed as the hitman. The Pakistani man was arrested. Plot foiled. But the Iranians have also been hacking the Trump campaign. They've distributed potentially damaging material. They're trying to sow division and discord among American voters. They're trying to kill Donald Trump because they are terrified of a second Trump term. So they're interfering just like that. And just as all this is revealed, Iran's president appears at the United Nations summit. He demands America drop sanctions. Takes nerve, doesn't it? You try to kill a presidential candidate and then demand we go easy on you. President Biden also appeared at the UN. It was probably his last appearance on the world stage, and he used it to burnish his legacy. But it is glaringly obvious that his legacy is clouded by his Iran policy. From the beginning, he allowed Iran access to oil money. He gave them cash. They spent it supporting the murderous Hamas and Hezbollah terrorists. He was trying to appease the mullahs, and in response, they tried to kill Donald Trump. There is no more dramatic example of election interference than that. Iran is a stain on the Biden-Harris legacy. Second hour of Varney, just getting started.
Thank you. And so the first thing is, I would have phrased it where I think what's amazing about the attempted assassination of President Trump, these plots by Iran, is that Iran is a bug. They have a minuscule economy, a minuscule military. We could crush them like a bug if we wanted to. So I think that takes, guts, a lot of guts to come after us like this. Now, also, as far as the Iranian plot is concerned, this is a good way, a good propaganda tool, so that if you get accusations from the Kamala Harris and her team about various things, what he said or what he's done, he can simply dismiss them as Iranian disinformation. Does that sound familiar? Or better yet, maybe as Chinese disinformation. As I said before, if Donald Trump had played his cards a little bit smarter back in 2020, he could have avoided the January 6th debacle. And that is by, instead of blaming the Democrats for cheating, he blames the communist Chinese that affected the election with the help of Hunter Biden. Nobody's going to investigate. Nobody in the Democrat Party is going to investigate the Communist Party or Hunter Biden. And here's another potential propaganda tool. Anything that the Harris campaign comes up with, you simply dismiss as Iranian disinformation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Patriotic Shorts.
These American tankers, the Germans feared the most. Did you know that there was a tank unit in the American Army that the Germans feared more than anyone else? It was the Black Panthers, the 761st Tank Battalion, a name that struck fear in even the elite units of the Wehrmacht. Formed in 1942, this battalion was made up of Black Americans, those who had faced racism and discrimination all their lives, but did not waver at the front. Few people know that Black Panthers participated in the liberation of Belgium and helped stop the German offensive in the Ardennes. They broke through enemy lines when other units could not. Their tanks tore apart German armored vehicles, and even the most experienced German officers couldn't stand up to them. The 761st was awarded numerous decorations for their exploits, but recognition did not come to them immediately. Despite all obstacles, they proved that bravery and skill are not dependent on skin color.
And that was the Patriotic Short. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, 8.5 minutes of motivation.
Today we gotta ghost everyone. Anyone that ever doubted us. Anyone that ever lied to us and told us that they believe in our vision. We gotta reset.
We live in a culture of busyness, distraction, and noise. And sometimes the only way something's going to change is if we disappear.
We gotta focus on the reason why we started everything. Why we woke up early in the morning to grind. Why we cried those tears. When we wanted the world to say yes, but everyone continued to say no. You see, you gotta forget about the dollars.
Can you unplug from people's ideas, from people's agendas, from people's viewpoints and perspective of you and life? Can you unplug?
Forget about the dollars that told you that you didn't have what it takes to be the greatest. You gotta reset.
What if you could just shut out every distraction? What if you could just shut out the world for just a season and focus on you? You have to disappear and put the work in and come back and shock everybody that doubted you.
You gotta understand the power of being alone. Let's go back into the darkness where all the greatness was created, where all the motivation was created. Let's get back to the beginning. Because only then will you hear the thoughts of the greats.
We celebrate athletes and we celebrate critical thinkers and innovators and actors, and we praise them and claim them our heroes, and we follow them by the millions. We love what they do in public, but you don't know the story behind the glory. You don't know the blood, the sweat. You didn't see the tears that they cried.
coast, everyone. You got to get back to that child that wanted to dream, that wanted to chase everything the world told him that he couldn't have. Yes, we got to reset. We're surrounded by the noise. We're surrounded by the social media, the Instagram, all of these things that give us no fulfillment. And the reason why you feel this way is because you've been surrounded by negativity. You've been surrounded by individuals that call themselves your friend. But in all reality, they're just another energy drainer. They're just another person that wants to tell you that you cannot accomplish your dreams because they failed at every obstacle they ever tried to defeat. Let's go back into that hole. Let's go back into the darkness.
Some of the most monumental and transformational portraits and pictures that we've ever seen were developed in the dark room. I'm talking to that athlete. I'm talking to that administrator. I'm talking to that nurse, that doctor. I'm talking to that student. I'm talking to that communicator. I'm talking to that pioneer, that inventor. I'm talking to that entrepreneur. I'm talking to that preacher. I'm talking to that person who refuses to stay where they are. I'm talking to that person that doesn't have a problem laying in obscurity because you know that when you come out of the dark room, all eyes on you. Rise from that ghost state. A new man and a new woman on its journey to greatness. Why are you here? What is your destiny? I got a question. What will you do when no one is watching? What will you do when no one is listening? That's the only time that we'll be able to bring something to this world that it never seen before.
One of the greatest challenges with disappearing is understanding the revelation of building in the dark. The secret of change is to focus all of our energy not on fighting the old, but building the new, and specifically behind closed doors when nobody's looking, when no one is there to affirm you, when nobody's there to validate you, when nobody is there to agree with you, you build in the dark and you announce it when it's finished.
Let me tell you, you're gonna fight until you can't fight no more. And when you can't fight anymore, you're gonna lay down and bleed a while. And then you're gonna get up and fight some more.
Sometimes you have to fall back into the dark room and focus on you. There are too many people in your life who have left you. There are too many people in your life who have counted you out. There are too many people in your life who have whispered in your ear and said, you'll be worse off without them. Prove them wrong. There are people in your life that claim to be your friends. And honestly, they are just standing there waiting to see you fail.
Yeah, you have those friends that come out to support you and tell you how great you are. But when they're driving off, leaving from the event, they're saying to themselves, I can do that better than him. Or I can do that better than her.
Disappear and do the work that is required. Sometimes you got to take a break from just about everything, disappear, come back, and shock the world.
You've been surrounded surrounded by individuals that call themselves your friend. They're just another person that wants to tell you that you cannot accomplish your dreams.
Are you worth my time? If you're not, it's time to unplug. Time to unplug. Time to unplug.
This is the process when you have to reset and when you have to ghost everyone.
And that was a little bit of motivation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, some meditation. And that was a little bit of meditation. Back in a minute. And now, the Daily Stoic.
Self-deception is our enemy. Zeno would also say that nothing is more hostile to a firm grasp on knowledge than self-deception. Diogenes Laertius, Lives of the Eminent Philosophers, 7.23. Self-deception, delusions of grandeur. These aren't just annoying personality traits. Ego is more than just off-putting and obnoxious. Instead, it's the sworn enemy of our ability to learn and grow. As Epictetus put it, it is impossible for a person to begin to learn what he thinks he already knows. Today, we will be unable to improve, unable to learn, unable to earn the respect of others, if we think we're already perfect, a genius admired far and wide. In this sense, ego and self-deception are the enemies of the things we wish to have, because we delude ourselves into believing that we already possess them. So we must meet ego with the hostility and contempt that it insidiously deploys against us, to keep it away, if only for 24 hours at a time.
And that was the Daily Stoic. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
One of my pet peeves is this claim in the culture that religion and science are diametrically opposed. In fact, it really bugs me that in study after study, young people often say the number one reason they leave the church is that science has refuted religion. A lot of people succumb to this modern myth, and it is distinctively modern, that religion and science are at loggerheads. There's so many great figures in the history of science have been devout believers. My favorite example being Georges Lemaitre, the formulator of the Big Bang theory of cosmic origins, which everybody believes today. He's a Catholic priest. I want to tell the counter story and then get that word out into the culture.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Thank you. And now the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Quote, there are two potential violators of man's rights, the criminals and the government. The great achievement of the United States was to draw a distinction between these two by forbidding to the second the legalized version of the activities of the first, unquote. Ayn Rand, from Man's Rights, from the Virtue of Selfishness. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the 33 Strategies of War.
Chapter 33. Sow uncertainty and panic through acts of terror. The chain reaction strategy. Terror is the ultimate way to paralyze a people's will to resist and destroy their ability to plan a strategic response. Such power is gained through sporadic acts of violence that create a constant feeling of threat, incubating a fear that spreads throughout the public sphere. The goal in a terror campaign is not battlefield victory, but causing maximum chaos and provoking the other side into desperate overreaction. Melting invisibly into the population, tailoring their actions for the mass media, the strategists of terror create the illusion that they are everywhere, and therefore that they are far more powerful than they really are. It is a war of nerves. The victims of terror must not succumb to fear or even anger. To plot the most effective counter-strategy, they must stay balanced. In the face of a terror campaign, one's rationality is the last line of defense.
And that was the 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. And if you're a Democrat, you want to vote Republican because the late modern achievement subject is free, in that it does not encounter repression on the part of sovereign entities external to itself. But in reality, it is just as unfree as the obedient subject. Once exterior repression is overcome, pressure builds within. Thus, the achievement subject develops depression. The violence persists unabated. It merely shifts to the interior. The stages of the topological transformation of violence are decapitation in the sovereignty society, deformation in the disciplinary society, and depression in the achievement society. Violence is increasingly internalized, psychologized, and thus rendered invisible. More and more, it rids itself of the negativity of the other or the enemy, becoming self-referential. Back in a minute. Thank you. Our educational system is failing because subversives have successfully claimed that history is written by the winners. This leaves the psychological impression that history is a matter of politics and not a matter of scholarship. And since all academic subjects have a history, they are now all under socio-political pressure. This makes our educational system unreliable, and our children suffer as a result. Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States and Queer Strippers in Elementary Schools are two examples of the subversives' use of our educational system as a tool to further their aims. To reestablish excellence in our educational system, we must reemphasize the scholarship involved in all subjects, but particularly in history. Back in a minute. Thank you. So last week, September 15th to September 21st, my weekly statistics from Spreaker, my downloads overall were up. The top 4 countries, the United States was actually down, but India was up, Bangladesh was up, and Australia was up. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Apollo, Chapter 1.
1. The reason an American space agency was recruiting Canadian engineers went back to November of the preceding year, when a new agency called the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, instantly shortened to NASA, was cobbled together by Congress and President Eisenhower. The reason NASA had been created went back another year to October 1957, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1 and triggered an American reaction resembling panic. A small globe of metal with a few crude instruments weighing 184 pounds, Sputnik 1 was not much of a satellite by later standards. But it was the planet's first artificial satellite, and it was not America's. 2 weeks later, the Russians compounded their triumph by orbiting Sputnik 2, a much larger satellite with a dog named Laika aboard. Not only did Sputnik 2 carry the dog, which suggested that the Soviets were thinking about putting human beings into space, the final stage of the rocket had remained attached to the satellite, which meant, incredibly and ominously, that the Soviet rocket had managed to put a 6-ton weight into Earth orbit. The United States, on the other hand, was working on a grapefruit-sized satellite weighing 3.5 pounds. 2 months later, the Department of the Navy tried to launch this puny competitor to Sputnik in front of television and newspaper cameras from around the world. The Vanguard rocket being used for the launch rose 4 feet into the air, fell back and crumpled onto the pad in a spectacular explosion. A few days later, the Soviet delegate to the United Nations inquired solicitously whether the United States was interested in receiving aid earmarked for underdeveloped countries. The public furor surrounding these events had been immense. Sputnik was the first time the Soviets had demonstrated superiority to the United States in any technological endeavor. It was especially galling to see them do it in a field as visible, as exotic, and as potentially dangerous as rockets and space exploration. In their humiliation, Americans lashed out at a variety of targets: the educational system, the military, Eisenhower's golf, American consumerism. There was a disquieting edge to the furor. The Dallas News wondered whether there weren't, after all, some advantages of tight totalitarian control. It was a thought heard elsewhere. Maybe a little more regimentation and discipline in this country wouldn't be such a bad thing. Life joined the clamor. In an article entitled "Arguing the Case for Being Panicky," the author likened the American of the 1950s to some fat Roman lolling in the baths of Caracalla shortly before the Visigoths sacked his city. President Eisenhower thought this was all a lot of hysterical poppycock, but he also decided that he couldn't ignore it. The United States was going to have a space program whether or not he wanted it. That much was clear. All he could do was try to keep it within bounds. One obvious place for the space program was Huntsville, Alabama, where the United States Army had stashed away the finest rocket scientists in the world, Wernher von Braun's Germans, the rocket team as it had been known in Germany, the men who had built the V-2. Von Braun's team could easily have beaten the Russians to the first satellite. Their Jupiter had been ready for more than a year to put up a satellite. But the Germans had been held back by a combination of jurisdictional disputes. Only the Air Force was supposed to build missiles with intercontinental range, and the administration's lukewarm interest in rocket technology. These barriers fell quickly after Sputnik. Given the go-ahead, von Braun's people put America's first satellite, Explorer 1, into orbit on January 31st, 1958. But Eisenhower was not willing to appoint von Braun head of the space program. There were many reasons for this. Among others, it would have been embarrassing for the American space program to be so blatantly a German enterprise. As important, von Braun was tied to the Army, and Ike was adamant that the American space program not be run by the military. This former general of the Army and supreme commander of the largest military expeditionary force in the history of the world was already harboring fears of the military-industrial complex that he would voice as he left office. Eisenhower found the perfect agency for his purpose in a venerable organization called the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, known to its friends as the NACA. The NACA had been around for 40 years, quietly going about its business of aeronautical research. It wasn't even an agency in the usual sense of the term, but rather a collection of aeronautical research facilities. Ike chose to hand over the satellite business to this small, unheralded group of civilians. He submitted his proposal to Congress in April. The legislation was passed in June, and on October 1st, 1958, a transmogrified NACA became NASA, responsible for America's space program. NASA, in the beginning, consisted of 4 centers: the semi-autonomous, competitive, insubordinate duchies that had formerly made up the NACA. The Lewis Research Center was in Cleveland, Ohio, a blue-collar center for a blue-collar town, a place where airplane propulsion systems were developed and tested. The Ames Research Center was just south of San Francisco, created during World War II to service the West Coast's growing aircraft industry. It now boasted a huge wind tunnel capable of testing full-size models of new aircraft. Also on the West Coast, down south in the Mojave Desert, was Edwards High-Speed Flight Station, famous for Chuck Yeager and Scott Crossfield, where the X-1 had broken the sound barrier and the X-15 was about to fly. Ames and Edwards would play little role in the manned space program. Lewis would contribute some critically important men to the program, but would do little of the actual work. It was left to the Mother Center, Langley, established in 1919, to serve as the birthplace of the manned space program. To understand how men came to walk on the moon, it is first of all necessary to understand something about the eccentric and beguiling and sometimes exasperating little world that was Langley. In 1917, the United States government realized to its dismay that the United States, home of the Wright brothers, couldn't build a plane to compete with the ones that England, France, and Germany were flying in the Great War. So the government created the NACA and provided funds for a research center that, for reasons having to do with land prices and flying weather, was located near Hampton. The facility's full name was the Samuel P. Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory, but everyone called it Langley. The people who decided to put it there failed to consider whether young engineers graduating from America's best schools in places like New Haven and Princeton would want to live on the tip of a rural Virginia peninsula. As small and isolated as it may have seemed to the men arriving in 1959, it was infinitely more so in earlier years. In 1917, when Langley began, Hampton was a place where people still referred to the Civil War as the Late War. This isolation meant that a great many bright young aeronautical engineers did not come to Langley, instead choosing more cosmopolitan places. It also meant that the ones who did make the trek down the peninsula tended to be highly motivated and a little odd. That was the first of the things that made Langley a world of its own. The geographic isolation was reinforced by cultural antagonism. The citizens of Hampton, Virginians to the marrow, didn't think much of the arriving Yankee engineers with their college educations. The Hamptonians called the newcomers knackanuts, or sometimes brainbusters, and had as little to do with them as possible. For their part, the knackanuts didn't think much of the locals. Soon after arriving in Hampton, the first engineer in charge was invited to speak at the Rotary Club. He took as his theme the great benefits that Hampton was going to derive from having Langley nearby. Finally, he told the Rotarians, Hampton would get a little culture. One way or another, it is not surprising that the engineers fraternized almost solely with one another. Another circumstance isolating Langley was the idiosyncrasy of a fellow named John Victory, the NACA's executive secretary in Washington from its founding in 1917 until its transformation in 1958. Under Victory, the ultimate fussy bureaucrat, Langley developed the wackiest administrative system in the history of the United States government. Because the executive secretary in Washington could make life unbearable for the engineer in charge down at Langley who failed to meet his demands, the engineers in charge from the 1920s onward completely centralized Langley's communications with the outside world. Every outgoing letter was reviewed by the individual branch chiefs and then sent out over the signature of the engineer in charge himself. Incoming letters were treated in the same way, opened and read by the engineer in charge's office before being routed to the people to whom they were addressed. Telephone calls were subject to the same kind of regulation, and because Victory insisted on conformity to the most minutely prescribed conventions of writing style and usage, Langley soon developed a common and idiosyncratic language into which new employees were quickly indoctrinated. We don't say it that way here at Langley. The system was comically restrictive, but it created a peaceful cocoon within which the engineers of Langley lived and worked, buffered from the politics of Washington, buffered from the exigencies of a competitive aircraft industry. Buffered as well by geography, it is not surprising that the engineers out on the peninsula soon developed their own comprehensive, seamless way of working, the Langley way. As the decades passed, the NACA remained small. It wanted to remain small. There was no one there with big ambitions of making a billion-dollar agency out of it, one old Langley hand remembered. The fact is, we avoided big projects, and they went about their research at their own Langley pace. A Langley veteran recalled that one night he stayed late, not very late, perhaps 6 o'clock, and found himself locked in his building. He called security and someone came over and let him out. Let that be a lesson to you, he was told. Don't stay after working hours. Another one-time Langley engineer remembered nostalgically that when you worked at Langley, time was not really a factor. The question was the elegance of what you were going to create. That, however, was a major proviso. If you were a Langley engineer, you didn't have to work long hours, but you did have to be perfect, or at least never publish a mistake. To that end, every research report that Langley published went through an agonizing review process, almost like writing a PhD thesis, in the words of one who suffered through it many times. When an engineer had written his report, it would be reviewed by his branch chief, his division chief, specialists selected by the office of the engineer in charge, and finally, an editorial committee chosen specifically for each paper. At each level of review, the author would be told to make revisions. That was for the technical content. At the end, the editorial office would vet the paper for syntax and grammar, so the prose would conform to the way we say things at Langley. It could take months to get what Langley called a technical note through the process. But if the pace was slow, the work was indeed elegant. Langley built superb facilities to do all its own development and testing. Langley never contracted any of its work to outsiders, a point of great pride. It had the best wind tunnels, the best model builders, the best technicians, and the most rigorous standards. An Air Force general, having listened to one of NACA's day-long technical briefings, once approached John Victory. The presentations had been superb, he said. Could Victory possibly send some people to the general's command to teach them NACA's methods? No point in it, Victory sniffed. The general's people wouldn't be able to use them. The Air Force didn't have the necessary discipline. Langley also sustained a uniquely collegial atmosphere. What was so marvelous about that NACA group, said a senior NASA official who himself came out of industry, was the opportunity to do real research and to really move things forward. I've heard those stories from the fellows. I went to work for such and such a company and found myself on a drawing board, said, to hell with it, and then went down to Langley, and a little later I'm working with Tommy Thompson. Engineers could do that at Langley. Walk in as bright young kids fresh out of school and start working side by side with some of the best aeronautical minds in the country. Men like Tommy Thompson, Hartley Soule, Bob Jones, and Abe Silverstein. In the Langley world, there was a thin line between work and play. Some Langley engineers flew their own airplanes. Others designed their own houses, leading to some of the strangest-looking homes on the eastern seaboard. But most commonly, the engineers of Langley would go home and build model airplanes, not from kits, but from their own designs, carved with their own tools, using their own hands. They had a club called the Brainbusters, after the Hampton label for Langley engineers. On Sunday afternoons, they would go down to the open meadows adjoining the airfield, a senior branch chief like William Hewitt Phillips alongside a brash junior engineer like Max Faget, or a local Hampton boy like Cadwell Johnson, or a gangly shop technician like Jack Kinsler. Each would bring his latest creation, a marvelously crafted machine with design touches that might be years ahead of its time. They paid no attention to rank, only to how the airplane performed and how it could be improved. From this strange mixture of ambling southern pace and obsessive perfectionism, family-like closeness and devotion to vocation, Langley turned out gems of aeronautical research. It wasn't like NASA, reminisced Cadwell Johnson, who would become one of the lead designers of the Apollo spacecraft. The press didn't care about it. To them, it was a dull bunch of gray buildings with gray people who worked with slide rules and wrote long equations on blackboards. But to the engineers within, it was a unique and wonderful place. Just a splendid organization, Johnson remembered fondly, and that's the way all the old Langley hands talked. Langley in those years became a kind of Elysium for young engineers in love with aeronautical research. On the same day that NASA officially replaced the NACA, Keith Glennon, NASA's first administrator, announced that the United States would put a man into space. The Russians were openly working toward this end. The United States didn't want to be humiliated again, and Eisenhower, once again reluctantly, went along with a small program to try to beat them. Looking for people to do it, Glennon turned to Langley, and more specifically to an engineer named Robert R. Gilruth. Gilruth, 45, avuncular and balding, was the prototypical Langley engineer. As a boy in Duluth, Minnesota, Gilruth had made model airplanes out of balsa with rubber band engines. By the time he was in his teens, he was writing to the NACA for technical papers on wing sections. At the University of Minnesota, he helped design and build the Laird Watt, the fastest airplane in the world. He went to work at Langley in 1937 and was assigned to flight test engineering. By the time World War II began, he ran the division. Unlike Wernher von Braun, who had been fascinated by spaceflight from the time he was a teenager, Gilruth got into the space business by accident. It was the middle of World War II, and Gilruth was receiving urgent requests for data on drag at transonic speeds. The Langley wind tunnels couldn't provide it because wind tunnels in those days were all closed-throat, and closed-throat tunnels choked at about Mach 0.85. Since Gilruth couldn't get data on transonic speeds in the wind tunnel, he had to create something that actually went faster than the speed of sound. Gilruth calculated that a properly streamlined shape dropped from a sufficient height would break the sound barrier. He and his engineers created such a shape, added some instrumentation, and dropped it from a B-29 at 30,000 feet. The bomb-like shape achieved a velocity of Mach 1.2, and Robert Gilruth provided the American aviation industry with its first good look at the transonic flight environment. Then it occurred to Gilruth and his engineers that they could drive the Mach numbers much higher if they mounted their supersonic shape on a rocket. That was an attractive prospect to the NACA and the Air Force because the X-1, the first plane intended to fly faster than the speed of sound, was already on the drawing boards. In early 1945, Gilruth was given a small supplementary appropriation to open a testing facility. He chose a site at Wallops Island, Virginia, a deserted stretch of Atlantic coast across the Chesapeake Bay 70 miles northeast of Langley. Spaceflight still had nothing to do with it. Gilruth, now running a unit called the Pilotless Aircraft Research Division, PARD, was just trying to get data about heat transfer at high Mach numbers. But there wasn't much to do at Wallops in the off hours, and Max Faget had a collection of astounding science fiction that everybody kept swapping around, Gilruth as enthusiastically as anyone. Besides, it was impossible to fire rockets into the sky for long without beginning to think about spaceflight. During the late 1940s and early 1950s, as PARD began working with multi-stage rockets, Gilruth and his engineers became the American civilians who knew more than anybody else about how to build a craft that could be put on top of a rocket and survive the dynamic stresses of launch and then the heat and deceleration of entry. When Eisenhower decreed that military experts on these topics were out of bounds, Gilruth became the natural choice for the person to lead an effort to send a man into space. He was appointed director of a small new entity created on November 5, 1958, called the Space Task Group. That famous Space Task Group is akin to the Mayflower, one man who wasn't a member pointed out, considering how many people tell you they were in it. As a matter of historical record, there were just 45 in the first boat. From Langley, there were 27 men, all engineers, and 8 women, all secretaries and computers, as the women who worked the calculating machines were called. Another 10 engineers were assigned to the Space Task Group from Lewis Lab in Cleveland. From the beginning, the Space Task Group had a catch-as-catch-can quality. Half of the men assigned to the Space Task Group from Langley were hand-picked by Gilruth. But Tommy Thompson, the director at Langley, didn't want his laboratories stripped of their best men. Gilruth recalled later that Thompson was all for me because he knew that if we didn't succeed, NASA wouldn't succeed. But when I gave him my memo of all the people I wanted, he said, "Okay, Bob, but for everyone that you want to take from Langley, I want to add one that I want you to take from Langley." And so that's how it worked out. All of them to this day wonder which half they were in, Cadwell Johnson wryly observed. Practically everyone was young. At 45, Gilruth was the old man. His deputy, Charles Donlin, was 42. The head of engineering, Max Faget, was 37, as was Chuck Matthews, head of flight operations. The rest were mostly in their early 30s or 20s, all the way down to the baby of the original 45, Glyn Lunny, at 21. They were uniformly young, partly because so few of the senior staff from the old NACA wanted to be part of the Space Task Group. In 1958 and 1959, manned spaceflight did not look like the kind of venture on which to bet one's career. So far, Congress and the President had authorized only Project Mercury, in which a man riding in one of the Space Task Group's capsules atop one of von Braun's Redstones would be lobbed into the upper reaches of the atmosphere. On subsequent Mercury missions, he would be launched into Earth orbit on the Air Force's Atlas. No one knew what was supposed to happen after this initial series of launches. No one even knew whether men could function in space. No one knew whether there was anything useful for them to do even if they could function, and the whole thing was going to be unspeakably expensive with no obvious return on the investment. To most of the senior engineers at Langley, manned spaceflight had the earmarks of a fad. Nor was it just that manned spaceflight was a risky career path. To many of the Langley engineers, it was an unattractive way to spend one's time. "You must remember," said Chris Kraft, the man who would later become famous as the manned space program's director of flight operations, that space was a word that wasn't even allowed in the NACA library. If it was anything that had to do with space, that didn't have anything to do with airplanes, so why were we working on it? To one young engineer in PARD, it seemed as if the people who went to the Space Task Group were outcasts. A senior Langley engineer came to him and told him not to go with the Space Task Group. "I have a job for you in my division," he said to the young man. "You don't want to ruin your career. There's nothing going to come of this, and you're going to be hurt by it." It just wasn't the Langley way, this business of implementing a manned satellite project, as the order creating the Space Task Group charter had phrased their mission. Langley didn't implement things. Langley did research, and it did everything itself. This manned space project was going to contract work to the outside. It would turn its engineers into bureaucrats. Gilruth remembered colleagues coming up to him during the first years and asking him, "Well, have you let any good contracts today?" Far from envying him his new position, most of his peers thought that he had chosen a horrible fate, and none of them took the same road. Not one of the other engineers of Gilruth's age or older transferred into the program. "They wanted to support us," said one engineer who went to the Space Task Group, "but through the traditional research avenues." Thus, in the years that followed, old-line Langley personnel would decisively affect the decision on how to get to the moon and would help to develop the lunar landing trainer at Langley. But they did not join up. The Langley engineers were right to be suspicious. The Space Task Group was going to cut corners and ignore protocol in ways that pained those trained in the Langley way. It was going to contract out much of its work, and it was going to abandon airplanes, the only proper flying machine for a Langley engineer to work on. The Space Task Group was going to do something that had never been done before. Glenn Lunny later realized that the ignorance of these early days was bliss. A lot of the senior engineers thought the project was crazy, and they were knowledgeable enough in the ways of the world to ask whether they wanted to risk their reputations, Lunny recalled. I, fortunately, was unknowledgeable in the ways of the world and said, "Gee, that looks like it would be a hell of a lot of fun to me. Let's go do that." Jack Kinsler reacted the same way. In the year before the Space Task Group was formed, Kinsler, one of the master craftsmen in whom Langley took so much pride, had begun to get excited about space. Werner von Braun had come up from Huntsville to Langley and given a talk about spaceflight. PARD had given some in-house seminars. "I got so consumed with space, I was just waiting for somebody to initiate an actual program," Kinsler said later. "So when I was asked to join the task group with Bob, I said I would drop anything to do that." As the word spread, Kinsler was overrun with applicants. "I'd have fellows come up to me and say, 'I want to go with you, Jack. I've been reading about it. I've been hearing about it.' So I got the dedicated guys who read all the space magazines and cared about the program." Sometimes it wasn't such a calculated decision. The workload facing the Space Task Group was so overwhelming that it exerted a kind of gravitational pull. John Mayer, one of the original 45, had formerly been part of the aircraft loads branch, along with Carl Huss and Ted Skupinski, who weren't. But no more than a week after the Space Task Group had been formed, Mayer was back visiting the aircraft loads lab in the West area, asking his friends to do some computer runs for him. The branch chief of aircraft loads said, "Okay, Carl and Ted could bootleg a little work to help out Johnny." And within another 2 weeks, Huss and Skupinski were doing more work for Mayer than they were for aircraft loads. "Ted and I sat across from each other at the same desk," Huss recalled. "One day we looked at each other and asked why we didn't transfer over to the Space Task Group. So we did." The first group was young and enthusiastic, but it was also tiny for such an ambitious project. By February 1959, the original 45 had grown to just over 100 people, and yet they were supposed to put a man into space. Moreover, there was this gap, as Lunny put it. We had these super generals and these super privates who were learning how to be corporals, but we didn't have a hell of a lot of guys in between. And that's where Owen Maynard came in. In the spring of 1959, as the Space Task Group's burden was threatening to overwhelm it, the Canadian government unintentionally gave the American space program its luckiest break since Wernher von Braun had surrendered to the Americans.
And that was part one of Apollo by Charles Murray and Catherine Bly Cox. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to trust yourself and trust your conscience.